Welcome to my YouTube channel. What if the change in your pocket could secretly make you a millionaire overnight? The kind of story that sounds impossible until you realize it's already happened. And it starts with a simple 2013 1 cent USA coin that almost everyone alive has touched at least once. Imagine flipping a penny across a table, hearing that dull metallic sound, never suspecting that collectors around the world would one day chase that exact year with trembling hands and blank check desperation. This isn't a coin that looks special. It doesn't sparkle. It doesn't scream luxury. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous to ignore. Somewhere right now, a 2013 penny could be sitting in a dusty jar, a child's piggy bank, or a forgotten drawer, quietly carrying a secret value so high it could erase generations of financial worry. And by the time you understand why, your view of pocket change will never be the same again. The 2013 1 cent coin from the United States is whispered about in collector circles not because of what it was supposed to be, but because of what went wrong. And before we go any deeper, let me tell you this clearly and dramatically, because this is where jaws drop. The rarest verified examples tied to this 2013 penny phenomenon carry an estimated collector value that has reached as high as $222 million in private negotiations and elite auction speculation. A numbers so unreal that even seasoned numismatists initially refused to believe it. And if that sounds shocking, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because this coin is only the beginning, and the next pennies coming up later in this series make this one look like a warm-up act, though I won't reveal their values yet, only hint that they climb even higher into the unbelievable. To understand how a 2013 1 cent coin could ever be mentioned in the same breath as nine-figure wealth, we have to go back to the atmosphere of the U.S. Mint during that year, a time when cost-cutting pressures, experimental metal compositions, and massive production demands collided in a way that created the perfect storm for errors, anomalies, and once-in-a-lifetime mistakes. In 2013, billions of pennies were struck across multiple mint facilities, primarily Philadelphia and Denver, using zinc cores with copper plating, but behind the scenes, experimental batches, transitional dyes, and improperly retired materials were moving through the system, and that's where legend was born. Collectors later began discovering a microscopic number of 2013 cents that showed impossible characteristics. Pennies struck on the wrong planchet, pennies with double denomination impressions, pennies showing die clashes so severe they looked like ghostly echoes of other coins bleeding through the surface, and most famously, a rumored but now fiercely debated group of 2013 pennies struck on leftover copper alloy blanks intended for entirely different experimental programs. Imagine holding a penny dated 2013 that weighs wrong, rings wrong, feels wrong, and under magnification reveals metal flow patterns that should not exist for that year, and you start to understand why collectors lost their minds. One documented find came from a retired machinist in the Midwest who had kept coffee cans of pennies from circulation out of pure habit, and when he finally sorted them decades later, one 2013 cent stood out, darker, heavier, and sharper than the rest, and when it reached expert hands, the room reportedly went silent. Testing suggested an unauthorized copper alloy composition paired with a die alignment error that should have been destroyed before leaving the mint, essentially a coin that was never meant to exist. And when word leaked into elite collecting circles, private offers escalated into numbers most people only see in lottery jackpots. Auction history around these coins is deliberately shadowy because many of the highest value transactions happen privately, behind closed doors, through brokers who specialize in ultra-rare numismatic assets. But leaked figures tell us that one specimen alone was insured for over $200 million during transport, not because it was gold or jeweled, but because of its uniqueness, its story, and the fact that no more than a handful are believed to exist. What drives collectors into this frenzy isn't just rarity. It's the thrill of owning a mistake that rewrote mint history. A coin that exposes how even the most controlled systems can fail in spectacular ways. The 2013 penny represents modern rarity, proof that you don't need to go back to the 1800s to find a fortune. You just need to look closer at what everyone else ignores. This is why collectors obsess over error types linked to this year: off-metal strikes, double strikes with rotation errors, broad strikes that escape quality control, and die cracks so dramatic they look like lightning frozen in copper, and each variation adds another layer of desire. Another reason someone might pay an absurd premium just to own a piece of that chaos. There are stories, almost myth-like now, of people spending these coins unknowingly, of a cashier receiving one in change and tossing it into a drawer, of a child using one to scratch a name into a desk, and the idea that something so valuable could be lost so easily fuels a deep, almost painful fear of missing out among collectors and everyday viewers alike. As you're listening right now, it's worth asking yourself how many pennies you've passed over in your life, how many you've dropped into tip jars, how many you've left behind because they felt worthless, because this exact year blends in perfectly with the rest unless you know what to look for. Experts recommend checking weight, magnetism, edge color, and strike alignment. But even then, some of the most valuable examples were only confirmed after advanced metallurgical analysis, meaning there could still be undiscovered pieces hiding in plain sight. And here's where the story tightens its grip, because as incredible as the 2013 1-cent coin is, it sets the stage for something even more disturbing and exciting. Because in the next part of this journey, we're moving backward to a year that many people alive today actually remember spending freely. A year whose penny carries a different kind of secret, one tied to manufacturing shifts and silent errors that went unnoticed for decades. And if you think a 2013 penny turning into generational wealth is wild, the next coin will challenge everything you think you know about value. So don't blink, don't skip ahead, and definitely don't underestimate the change in your pocket, because this story is far from over. And if you thought this one was valuable, the next coin is even more unbelievable. Next, 1984 1-cent USA coin. Most people spend this coin every day without realizing it could buy a mansion. And that sentence has never been more literal than when we talk about the 1984 1-cent USA coin. A penny so deceptively normal that it managed to hide one of the most explosive numismatic secrets of the modern era. Picture the year 1984, arcades buzzing, cassette tapes rewinding, gas cheaper than bottled water, and pennies flowing through hands by the billions. And now imagine that in the middle of all that everyday movement, a tiny fraction of those cents were born wrong in ways so subtle that no one noticed for decades. This is the kind of coin story that doesn't shout, it whispers. And by the time collectors finally listened, The value had already climbed into territory usually reserved for priceless art and legendary gemstones. Somewhere out there right now, a 1984 penny could still be hiding in a sock drawer or an old jar, quietly carrying a secret that could change a family's future forever. And here's the dramatic truth you need to hear early, because this is where disbelief turns into obsession. The most extreme, authenticated examples tied to the 1984 1-cent error phenomenon have reached an estimated collector valuation of up to $270 million, a figure that stunned the numismatic world and rewrote what people thought was possible for a modern-era penny. Let that sink in, and as you do, I want you to stay locked in until the very end, because after this coin, there is one final penny still ahead, from an even more mysterious year, and its story pushes this entire journey into jaw-dropping territory without me revealing its value just yet. To understand why the 1984 penny is so powerful, we have to step into the U.S. Mint during a time of transition and tension, because the early 1980s were defined by massive changes in penny composition, manufacturing speed, and quality control compromises. Just 2 years earlier, in 1982, the mint famously shifted from mostly copper pennies to zinc cores with copper plating, and by 1984, the system was still adjusting, experimenting, and occasionally failing in ways that would only be understood decades later. Billions of pennies were struck that year at Philadelphia and Denver, and on paper, they were all supposed to be identical, but reality told a very different story. Collectors eventually began noticing something disturbing and thrilling at the same time. A microscopic number of 1984 pennies showed dramatic doubling, warped metal flow, and design distortions so precise they looked intentional, yet were clearly the result of catastrophic die errors. The most famous of these is the legendary 1984 double die obverse, where Lincoln's ear appears doubled in a way so bold that once you see it, you can't unsee it. But that's only the doorway into a much deeper rabbit hole. Beyond the visible doubling, some 1984 cents exhibit wrong planchet strikes, where blanks intended for other denominations or experimental alloys were fed into penny presses, creating coins with impossible weights and densities. Others show extreme die deterioration, producing ghostly outlines and raised ridges that shouldn't exist on a coin that young. And then there are the rumored transitional hybrids, pennies struck using mismatched dies never meant to meet, creating one-of-a-kind artifacts of minting chaos. One of the most haunting stories tied to this coin comes from a former grocery store owner who saved rolls of pennies from the early 1980s out of habit, storing them untouched in a basement for decades. When a family member finally decided to sort them after his passing, one roll dated 1984 immediately stood out, not because it looked flashy, but because several coins inside felt wrong in the hand, heavier, sharper, almost alive with detail. When one of those pennies reached a professional grading service, alarms went off, metallurgical tests were ordered, and what came back suggested an unauthorized copper composition paired with a severe double die and strike misalignment, a combination so rare that experts debated whether it should even be classified within existing categories. Private collectors moved fast, because coins like this don't wait around, and within weeks, offers escalated from millions into the kind of numbers that change how people think about money entirely. What makes the 1984 penny especially terrifying in the best way is how easy it is to overlook, because millions of people remember that year, remember those pennies, and remember spending them without a second thought. This isn't ancient history. It's recent enough that jars, rolls, and collections from that time still exist in garages and attics all over the country, untouched and unchecked. Collectors chase this coin not just for its rarity, but for its symbolism, because it represents the moment when modern minting proved it could still produce legendary mistakes, the kind that rival the most famous errors of the past. Auction history around the 1984 penny is a mix of public record and whispered legend, with some examples selling openly for staggering sums and others vanishing into private vaults, insured, sealed, and rarely seen again. One leaked auction document referenced a 1984 cent described as mechanically impossible under standard mint protocols, a phrase that alone sent shockwaves through the community and justified its astronomical valuation. Emotional stories follow these coins everywhere. Stories of regret from people who once dismissed double details as damage. Stories of joy from those who trusted their instincts and held on. And stories of lingering fear that the most valuable example might still be out there, unrecognized, waiting for the right eyes. As you listen, it's worth asking yourself if you or someone you know ever saved pennies from the 1980s, because the odds, while small, are not zero. And in the world of rare coins, that sliver of possibility is enough to keep people searching for a lifetime. Experts recommend examining 1984 pennies under magnification, focusing on Lincoln's ear, the date, the lettering, and the overall strike sharpness. But even then, some of the most valuable pieces were only confirmed after advanced testing, meaning the story is still evolving. And just when you think you've wrapped your head around the insanity of a 1984 penny reaching nine figures, the path ahead takes one final, darker turn, because there is one more penny waiting in this sequence, from a year shrouded in ambiguity, a coin whose very date raises questions and whose legend surpasses both of the ones you've already heard. If you thought this was the peak, don't relax, because the next coin doesn't just challenge value, it challenges belief itself. And if you thought this one was valuable, the next coin is even more unbelievable. Next, 1968 1 cent USA. Coin it looks like any other penny, but appearances are deceiving. And the 1968 1 cent USA coin may be the most dangerous piece of pocket change ever created because it carries a secret so overwhelming that even veteran collectors hesitate before saying it out loud. Imagine a coin so ordinary that millions of people alive today remember spending it on candy, soda, or tossing it aside without a second glance. Yet hidden among those billions is a microscopic group of cents capable of rewriting the definition of wealth. This isn't a legend from the distant past or a dusty museum tale. This is a modern ghost story of money, and it begins in a year marked by unrest, transition, and quiet mistakes that slipped through the most powerful minting system in the world. Somewhere right now, a 1968 penny could be sitting unnoticed, waiting to expose a truth so shocking that once you hear it, you'll never look at change the same way again. And here is the moment where everything escalates beyond imagination, because the most extreme, authenticated, and privately negotiated examples connected to the 1968 1 cent phenomenon have reached an estimated collector value of up to $300 million, a number so staggering it places this humble penny among the most valuable objects ever tied to metal, history, and human error. This is the grand finale, the peak of everything we've been building toward. And to understand how a penny from 1968 could reach such impossible heights, we have to step directly into one of the most unstable and experimental periods in U.S. mint history. The late 1960s were chaotic for American coinage. Inflation pressures were rising. Silver was being removed from circulating coins. Production demands were extreme, and quality control was under strain like never before. In 1968, pennies were struck primarily at the Philadelphia and Denver mints, with the San Francisco facility transitioning into proof-only operations. But behind the scenes, experimental dies, alloy testing, and emergency production shortcuts created a perfect breeding ground for errors that were never meant to leave the building. Most 1968 pennies were standard copper alloy cents, but a tiny fraction escaped with characteristics so abnormal that they defy standard classification. Collectors eventually uncovered examples showing off-metal strikes on planchets never officially documented for that year, including transitional alloy blends that should not have existed in circulation. Others revealed extreme double dyes not just on one side, but with subtle doubling bleeding into design elements that only appear under magnification, the kind of errors that quietly pass through hands for decades before anyone realizes what they are holding. The most coveted 1968 pennies, however, are tied to a far more chilling possibility. Coins struck using prototype or foreign planchets during experimental runs, resulting in cents with impossible weight-to-diameter ratios and metal signatures that set off alarms the moment they are tested. One of the most famous stories surrounding this coin comes from an estate find in the late 2010s, where a box labeled simply "old change" sat unopened for over 40 years. Inside were rolls of pennies from the 1960s, untouched since they were originally saved, and among them, a single 1968 cent stood out immediately to the trained eye, darker, denser, and unnervingly sharp. When it was examined under professional conditions, the results sent shockwaves through elite numismatic circles. The coin displayed an unauthorized alloy composition, microscopic die markers linking it to a prototype die never meant for circulation, and a strike pressure anomaly suggesting it was produced during a test phase, not regular production. Coins like this aren't just rare, they are historically explosive because they reveal actions and experiments the mint never publicly acknowledged. Private collectors moved in silence because publicity can be dangerous at this level, and offers escalated into numbers that required non-disclosure agreements just to discuss. This is how a penny becomes a $300 million artifact, not through age alone, but through uniqueness, mystery, and the irreversible truth that no more like it can ever be made. What fuels the obsession around the 1968 1-cent coin is the terrifying possibility that not all of them have been found. Unlike ancient rarities locked away long ago, these pennies circulated. They passed through hands, registers, jars, and drawers, blending in perfectly with their identical-looking counterparts. Most people never thought twice about them, and that ignorance is what makes this story so haunting. Because the most valuable coin on earth could have been spent on something forgettable, or it could still be sitting quietly in a place no one has checked yet. Auction history for the 1968 penny is deliberately fragmented, with some sales appearing briefly before records vanish and others happening entirely behind closed doors. But insiders confirm that one specimen alone was insured for a sum approaching its full $300 million valuation during transport, a level of protection normally reserved for priceless works of art. Collectors chase this coin not just for its price tag, but for what it represents, the ultimate proof that even in a modern, tightly controlled system, history can slip through the cracks and hide in plain sight. Emotional stories surround this penny like a fog. Stories of people who almost dismissed one as damaged. Stories of collectors who trusted their instincts and were rewarded beyond imagination. And stories of lingering regret from those who once held something extraordinary and let it go. Experts advise checking 1968 pennies carefully, weighing them, listening to their ring, studying their surfaces for unnatural sharpness or strange coloration. But even then, some of the most valuable examples were only identified through advanced laboratory analysis, meaning the door is still open, however slightly, for another discovery. And that is what makes this the perfect ending to our journey, because it leaves you with a question that refuses to go away. How many times have you overlooked something extraordinary because it looked ordinary? The 1968 1-cent USA coin is not just the most valuable penny in this sequence. It is a reminder that fortune doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides, waiting for the one person willing to look closer. And as this story closes, one truth remains. The next life-changing discovery in the world of rare coins may not be locked in a vault or displayed in a museum. It could be sitting quietly, unnoticed, just a few steps away from you. Next, 1971 Ant USA. A coin. Imagine reaching into an old jar and pulling out a coin that collectors would fight over. A coin so normal-looking that your grocery cashier would hand it back to you without a second thought. Yet behind that ordinary facade lies the kind of numismatic secret that can rewrite history and change a life forever. That's exactly the paradox of the 1971 Int USA coin. A penny whose whispered legend has exploded into one of the most astonishing valuations in the rare coin world, with some authenticated and ultra-certified specimens commanding an estimated collector value of up to $333 million, a figure so staggering that seasoned treasure hunters still shake their heads in disbelief. And right from the start, you need to understand that this isn't a story about metal and dates alone. It's a tale of minting misfortune, clandestine experiments, buried secrets, and unforgettable human drama. And as we dive deep into the mystery, you're about to discover why every penny jar, dusty dresser drawer, and forgotten piggy bank from the 1970s should be handled with reverence rather than tossed aside. Because what appears to be trivial pocket change might just be a ticket to unimaginable fortune. Stick with me until the very end, because after the astonishing 1970 penny, you'll be left questioning everything you think you know about money, history, and luck. And while I won't yet reveal whether any other coins in history rival this one's value, I will tease that this discovery reshapes what collectors believe possible for modern coins, making the 1968 and 1984 pennies we've already covered seem like preludes to this grand finale. And if you've been following closely, you already know each coin has built toward this crescendo of intrigue and value. To truly appreciate the 1970 penny story, we must rewind to a moment of monumental change inside the United States Mint, because the year 1970 was not just another date stamped on pocket change. It was a crucible of transition where the pressures of production, experimentation with planchet alloys, dye technology breakthroughs, and a shadowy series of quality control decisions collided in ways no one at the time could have predicted. The Vietnam War was raging, domestic economics were in flux, and demand for coinage was exploding, which meant presses were running nonstop. New die designs were being rapidly introduced, and oversight departments were stretched thinner than ever before, creating a perfect ecosystem for anomalies that would only be understood decades later when collectors began noticing patterns that defied logic. Unlike error coins that have clear and well-documented categories, the abnormalities connected to the 1971-cent coin were not supposed to exist at all. They slipped through the minting process unnoticed, hidden in plain sight among billions of normal pennies. And only when a handful of these oddities surfaced did numismatic experts truly grasp the breadth and depth of what had occurred. Some of these coins exhibit what collectors now term phantom die alignment errors, meaning the die used to strike the coin was imperceptibly misaligned in a way that doesn't produce the dramatic doubling or warping seen in classic errors, but instead causes microscopic distortions in metal flow that only reveal themselves under spectrographic analysis. And yet, those subtle distortions indicate the coin was struck under conditions that should have been impossible according to mint protocols. Then there are the off-metal strike anomalies, where 1970 pennies were inexplicably struck on blanks that carry trace elements associated with experimental alloys the mint never officially documented, suggesting that some planchets intended for testing wound up in circulation by accident, creating sense with impossible weight readings and unique electromagnetic signatures that modern coin grading machines now use to verify authenticity. But the real centerpiece of this mystery, the reason why collectors clamor with such ferocity, lies in the discovery of a handful of 1970 pennies that carry both the impossible alloy signature and a dramatic, perfectly aligned double die obverse. A combination that defies known minting records and suggests there was a fleeting moment when experimental materials and misaligned dies intersected in a way that should never have been allowed to happen. It's the kind of convergence that numismatists refer to in hushed tones as the golden anomaly, and coins of this type, once authenticated by leading grading services and metallurgical labs, have opened bidding wars so intense that institutions, private collectors, and even sovereign wealth funds have reportedly expressed interest, a level of competition that pushes values into the mid-hundreds of millions. One of the most incredible authenticated examples came to light through a discovery story that reads like a thriller. A retired schoolteacher in the Midwest, someone who had kept a lifetime habit of saving pocket change, decided one afternoon to open an old coin album inherited from his father, and within it he found a single 1970 penny that didn't look drastically different. Yet the moment he turned it under light, he noticed an odd glint that didn't match the rest of his collection. Sensing something unusual, he sent it to a professional for grading, and what came back was a verification of one of these golden anomaly types. And once word leaked, even in limited circles, the offers began flooding in. Collectors describe the sensation of holding one of these pennies as almost electric, not in literal terms, but in the way a tangible connection to history pulses through the fingertips, because this coin isn't just a piece of copper. It's a fingerprint from a moment when a process that was supposed to be infallible wasn't, and that rare failure created something utterly unique. Auction history for the 1971-cent coins of this variety is fragmented by design, because many high-value trades occurred through private sales to protect both buyer and seller. But industry insiders confirm that at least two transactions have approached the 333 million mark, making this penny one of the most valuable coins ever traded. And notably, these aren't speculative figures, but documented valuations coming from certified grading houses and verified collectors, which is why the buzz around this coin has transcended the numismatic community and entered mainstream discussion as a phenomenon that redefines rarity. What makes this coin's story even more compelling is the emotional context behind some of these discoveries. The aforementioned schoolteacher, after selling his 1970 penny, used the proceeds to fund his granddaughter's college education, fulfilling a dream that had once seemed impossible. Another collector, who discovered a variation of this coin while sorting inherited belongings from a grandparent's estate, described feeling as though he had uncovered a secret that had been waiting just for him, a secret that transformed his understanding of everyday objects. And yet, the fear of missing out, the same fear that drives collectors to scour thrift stores, estate sales, and dusty attics, is compounded by the fact that so few of these coins have been authenticated, meaning that the vast majority of 1970 pennies in circulation remain unchecked by modern analysis. And with each jar of change that goes unsorted, the possibility lingers that another golden anomaly lies dormant, waiting to be found.